So we are going to explore Myanmar in more detail because there is a lot going on here. We have an evolving situation. And before we get started, I just wanted to show you this beautiful picture because they're in a lot of chaos at the moment. But there is a huge amount of beauty in Myanmar. This is obviously a cultural landscape, right? The built things that express the culture. This is a majority Buddhist country, and we have a similar shape to the temples here. That's what this is. This is a whole complex of temples. They're similar to the shape of the spires and the buildings that we saw at Angkor Wat in Cambodia. But we do have kind of more of a bulb here. Right? They're more rounded. So it's a similar aspect, but not the same, which makes sense because we know that cultural landscape varies across culture. So remember where we are here. This is the country that we are going to be talking about. Remember Myanmar or Burma. Both are correct. The government there has said either is fine. They mean the same thing. It was called Burma more commonly when it was still a colony and in the past, and then Myanmar more recently. So both are correct. It's the one that has sort of a diamond shape and then a tail that goes down the Malay Peninsula. And notice that we have a fair amount of elevation change here. There's the north is pretty mountainous. It's part of, remember those chains of mountains that we talked about in the eastern part of India, where it's pretty rugged and a fairly difficult terrain. We're right next door. Here is the arm of India that reaches around to the east. So we're right next to that. And those rugged mountains and then river valleys between them. This is the Irrawaddy River. It's the most important river in Myanmar. That we have a similar terrain. Okay? So this is where that is. And as I said, right, it was formerly a British colony. It was not part of British India, but it was part of British holdings in the area. And this is a country that has had a lot of back and forth between the military control and trying to get away from military control. So there was a period of time where they were controlled by the military after independence, and now we're not quite sure what's going on there because the group of military leaders has seized control again. And this group of military leaders, a group of military officials who seize and then rule a country after a coup, after seizing power, that is called a junta. And we have a junta here that ruled and controlled from into the 60s into just about 10 years ago, and now they seem to have taken control again. And so a junta is, again, that group of military officials that seizes control and then rules with military control. And here is a picture of what a lot of them look like, right? All sorts of medals, all men in this case. I'm not sure that I've ever heard of a military junta that is run by a woman. This is obviously a person who is not part of that junta. Her name is Aung San Suu Kyi, and we will get to her in just a second. So there was a military coup in 1962 after a short period of independence from the British and some democratically elected officials. Okay, so they did have some free elections, but there was a lot of instability, and the military took over. And the man who had been the independence leader and who they overthrew, he was actually assassinated by another politician. And that man was this woman's daughter. Okay, so she is actually the daughter of the independence leader. He was assassinated when she was about 2, but the family has always been very popular, and she has always spoken out against the junta and for returning to democratically elected government and to have the restoration of people's rights. And so again, there is her name. Her name is Aung San Suu Kyi, and the K makes kind of a ch sound here. And she grew up in Myanmar, and then she went to England for college. While she was there, she met her husband, and they had a couple boys. And she continued to speak out against the repressive government. And this was a government where they do a lot of not just repressing the press and repressing free speech, and anybody that speaks out against them, often those people disappear. There have been a lot of attempts to get them to loosen their grip over the years. This is a Buddhist country, and a lot of monks have actually self-immolated. They have set themselves on fire in protest. And so there have been some efforts over time to try and get this junta to release its grip, but it has never worked. It is also just repressive and difficult to understand why they do what they do. I mean, they're motivated by money and by power. But a few years ago, there was a very large typhoon that came through the area, and they were so afraid of outside voices coming in that they refused to let any aid come in. That people were starving, people's houses had been destroyed, but they still refused to let any help in. And Aung San Suu Kyi continued to speak out against them. And she came home because her mother was sick. This was decades ago. And while she was there, she started speaking out more, and of course the regime didn't like that at all. And they put her under arrest. They arrested her and threw her in jail. And they told her, basically, if you leave, we'll let you go. Right? We'll let you leave the country, and as long as you promise not to come back, we're fine. She refused to do that because she was defending her people. She felt like she needed to continue to fight for them and hold out for democracy. And so they held her under house arrest for her protection. It was never clear why she needed to be protected, but they held her for more than 15 years. And while she was being held, she actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts towards democracy, for her efforts for human rights, and the way that she spoke for her people. So this was the situation after years of a very repressive military control, after years of the kind of repression and putting down any other kind of voices, including of anyone, other leaders besides Aung San Suu Kyi. Finally, then, in 2010, she was released. It was rather sudden. No one was expecting her to be released, and there were a lot of concerns that she was actually going to be assassinated, that the junta would just assassinate her to kind of try to end things that way. Luckily, that did not happen, and instead, the junta began loosening things a bit more, and they started moving towards elections. And then, just a few months later, less than a year after she was released, there were finally some pretty free elections, and the first president with no military ties in over 50 years was elected. It was actually this man, who is a very good friend of Aung San Suu Kyi. And she was not able to stand for election because the way that the military wrote the Constitution, as they began to loosen things up and they began to allow some change, they actually wrote the Constitution so that she could not hold official office. She can't be president, she can't be the prime minister, because she is married to someone who was a foreign person, was from some other country, and she has children who are not there in Myanmar. And so they actually wrote in the Constitution that if someone has those things, they can't be elected. But she is the de facto leader. She's pretty much the head of the government. She's the head of the leading voice of opposition to the junta. And I'm going to pause there and pick up and talk about what has been happening since she and her party came into power.